Okay, so let's go ahead and get into this. This is a game that I played earlier today on chess.com. It's a 30-minute rapid game. My opponent was Fernando, 1617, uh, rated 1628 at the time of the game. My rating is 1660 in the rapid category on chess.com. So this game is a good example of I think things that people run into at this level. So 1600 rating, club player level chess. It's a good illustration. There were good moments, instructive moments, and we'll sort of get into all that. So to start off, d4, knight f6, bishop f4, e6, e3, c5. It's a London system. I'm not going to say a lot about the opening. It's just sort of part of my general philosophy to not get too hung up on too much in the opening because, again, I think people at our level, which is to say people at roughly the 2000 level or lower, I think for the vast majority of people below the 2000 rating level, getting too hung up on the opening is not terribly productive. So I'm not going to say a lot. Might say a few things here and there, but this is definitely not going to be a treatise on move order. In the opening, things of that nature. It's more sort of middle game ideas, interesting things that might have happened in the middle game. What are some instructive things there? So c5 by black, c3, a6, knight d2, g6. So black gets ready to fianchetto their bishop. Knight g to f3. Normal London system stuff at this point. Black takes on d4. I opt for the e pawn capturing back, trying to insert some dynamism into the play. Maybe unbalance it a bit. Black plays bishop to g7, and then I play bishop d6, trying to clamp down on black's position. Black hasn't pushed their d pawn yet, and this is going to, cramp them for a while. Most immediately, it's going to really hinder their ability to castle. And my general plan is to sort of make things tough on black in that way. Interestingly, from this position, I think to a lot of us human beings. So in a lot of the analysis that's to come, I'm using heavily sort of weighing on the engine to give a feel of best play, and I'm also going to offer my characterization of maybe what the engine is trying to tell us, or at least try to put in human terms, sort of why the moves the engine says are best in a given position should make sense to us too as human beings. So bishop d6, I think makes sense to human beings, but interestingly, the engine would actually prefer a move like knight c4 here, or even h3, just making way for the dark squared bishop in case it's attacked by knight h5, something like that. So in any case, bishop d6, black plays knight to c6, and I go for bishop d3 here. So the idea here is, I think a lot of people, if you look at treatises, not treatises, but even YouTube videos, different books on the London, a recurring idea is if black sets up a fianchetto structure, you don't want to put your light squared bishop on d3 where it's more or less biting on granite. So yes, I'm very well aware of that, but my idea here was I wanted to control the e4 square, and in some cases I was thinking about playing h4 h5 to go ahead and try to break open black's king side, and the bishop on d3 would prove helpful actually in a variation that we're going to see in a bit, would prove helpful for such a scenario. So black continues with their plan, with their previous move, bringing the knight to c6 to then put it back on e7 to try to block the scope of my bishop and enable castling. So at this point I come to, I think, a situation that perhaps a lot of people at the club level find themselves in. So more or less the opening is winding down. We don't want to necessarily say it's over at this point, but it's more or less winding down, and the question is what to do next. So in this case, I fiddled around with a few ideas, but as it turns out, the idea that I played, while it sort of makes sense on its face, it was not ideal. So I went for knight e5. And it makes sense, right? So bring another piece onto black side of the board, and sort of go from there. It's not obvious sort of how I'm breaking through at this point, but just go ahead. I'm putting my pieces in good positions, and there should be something that comes out of that. As it turns out, moves like castling, a4, are going to be somewhat better. But interestingly, the plan that I mentioned previously is actually what I should have went for. So h4, trying to crack open black's king side. Here, a continuation line. This is not forced, but black had tried to fianchetto their bishop. They would probably want to opt for b6 and not b5, because in response to b5, white can try to go at it with a4 and destabilize the queenside structure and possibly win a pawn, as it turns out. So b6 looks to be a little bit better option to try to fianchetto the bishop and continue their development. White continues with their plan, h5. Black goes knight takes h5. And interestingly, if you know anything about the London and these types of structures against like Grunfeld defenses, King's Indian defenses, things like that, this rook takes h5 exchange sacrifice can be a very sort of advantageous thing to go in for. And that's why I want to look at this line a little bit. So, of course, we're sacrificing an exchange. Black takes, g takes h5, and now we jump in. Bishop b7, regain the pawn. Here we're threatening queen takes f7 mate, so black has to do something about that. Knight g6, stopping mate, and now white saves their pawn with g3. And as it turns out, white is almost winning in this position, with the engine saying it's something like plus 1.9. And this, again, is despite being down in exchange. I think this is a really instructive variation about dynamic, or that sort of shows dynamic attacking chess. And it's these kind of things I know personally I'm trying to get a better feel for, and I think a lot of people at the club level, a lot of people, especially newer folks to chess, we struggle with, right? So we think oftentimes in terms of, okay, if I lose a pawn or if I lose a piece or whatever, I'm just losing, and we don't look so much at how the dynamics of how the pieces can interact can make up for just material losses, right? So it's not all about material, it's about sort of what our pieces are doing in a given position. And again, even though white is down here in terms of material, white as it turns out is basically almost winning. Okay, so going back to the game, here again I had the question of what to do, and I went for knight e5. It's not a horrible move, but as it turns out I had better options. Black castles, and then again I'm just trying to get more pieces out. Queen f3, with the idea of putting some pressure here on black's queen side, making it difficult to develop via moving the b pawn. The rook is x-rayed through the b pawn, so yeah, just generally trying to make things more difficult for black. Knight e8, black attacks my strong bishop. Knight d to c4, trying to gain more development, trying to go forward with my pieces, forgetting the fact that, you know, black can take a bishop, but I'm going to replace it with a strong knight, not retreating my bishop. Knight takes, f5. Not really sure what the point of this move was, but yeah. Okay, so here is, I think, a really another really instructive point after black plays f5. So in this position, this is a thing I struggle with, and I suspect a lot of people struggle with. Here it looks like I can just win a pawn. Knight takes b7, bishop takes b7, queen takes b7, right? And I'm looking around the board, and I'm not really seeing anything else too obvious in terms of how I can immediately win. I know I've got much better pieces than black has. But again, something I struggle with, I think other people probably struggle with it as well. Because I cannot see an immediate win, I think I need to do something tangible. And I'm not okay with just sort of letting the position sit, letting the pieces sit and be strong a few more moves and waiting for something to happen. So this felt need of needing to cash in here, which is what I did. Knight takes b7, going for this winning of a pawn. Turns out it wasn't good. And in fact, if black had played correctly or found the best moves, it turns out they're hard to find. But if black had done that, I was actually losing after this move, even though it looks like I'm winning a pawn. Better way to go would be something like pushing the a pawn, trying to clamp down on black's queen side. Again, just letting my good pieces sit in the center and being okay with that. So the sample continuation line here, black plays queen c7, knight e to c4, protecting my attacked d6 knight, knight to d5, jumping in, castling, bishop f6, rook fe1, bishop to e7, trying to do something about my strong pieces. I got to do something about this, so I'll do away with their bishop. Knight takes knight takes c8, rook a takes c8, a5. I've clamped down on black's position, and then black might play something like bishop f6. So again here, as it turns out, white's only slightly better, but this is sort of an ideal continuation for white from this position. The cashing in with knight takes b7, not ideal. This is the position, something like this is what you want to get to. And again, this speaks to the idea that I overestimated, I think, what I had in this position. I'm thinking, okay, I win a pawn. I've not won the game yet, but I'm in really good shape. As it turns out, best play, you get to a position like this, and white has a small edge. White is doing fine, but it's not like white is killing black at this point. So a case of over-evaluation of the strength of the position on my part, and I think something a lot of people can relate to. So knight takes b7, I go in to try to take the pawn. As it turns out, and this is where it's hard for black, because the most obvious move, bishop takes b7, is actually not what black should play in this position. So we'll look at that in a second, but black should play queen c7. White gets out, knight c5, and attacks the a8 rook. So black has to do something about that. Rook a7, knight b3, getting out of the potential fork with d6, forking the two knights. Sorry. Knight b3, a5, coming after my knight, castling short, continue my development. a4, coming after the knight again. So I've got to retreat the knight once again. So in this case, something like knight c1, black plays a3, and now black has put white on the retreat in this position. So in a position where it looks like white has just won a pawn. Black has this option going in for queen c7, not capturing the knight, ending in this position. Black is down a pawn, but black has created all sorts of activity for their pieces. They're going to go something like a takes b3 soon, the c3, or a takes b2 soon. The c3 pawn is going to be weak. As it turns out, black is close to winning in this position despite being down a pawn. But again, all this is very hard for any opponent in this rating range, myself included, to see. Black does the somewhat normal thing here. Bishop takes b7. Queen takes b7. Takes my strong knight, which as it turns out is good. You don't want to do something like immediately attacking my queen here, because I just get to win another pawn, right? So you want to get rid of this strong knight, as black does. Bishop takes e5, d takes e5. Now get the queen out of there. I go in for taking another pawn, so basically we trade. Queen takes, rook takes, castling short, and now queen c7. It looks here, when this move happened, I was like, okay, I've won this game. This is over. If you want to have a quick quiz, pause the video here and look for white's opportunity to win a piece. Okay, so it's the move I played in the game. Queen a3, and this attacks the b2 rook. It attacks the e7 knight, and it just looks like white is winning material. And opponent saw this, of course, and probably panicked a little bit and is thinking, okay, I gotta save my most valuable piece. They played rook b to b8, and I win a piece. But it turns out black had a better option. Rook to d2. This is something hard, again, for myself, and I think a lot of people at this rating range and lower, to see the opportunity of responding to a threat, so in this case a fork, not by trying to defend everything, but trying to go on the counterattack yourself, right? So rook d2, I'm threatening to take black's knight, but they're threatening to take my rook, so it could balance things out. So a sample continuation would be something like rook a d1, rook takes, knight c6, queen to d6, trading queens, the king comes up, bishop b5, trying to create some weaknesses, e5, creating those weaknesses. Now I've opened things up where I've got two protected pass pawns, and white is doing really well in this position as well. It's not an ideal situation for black, but it turns out that, black could have gotten to a position like this where they're just down a pawn. They've got to hold on to defend, but it's better than losing a whole piece as they did in the game. So queen takes e7, queen takes e5, taking the pawn. And now I think, I'm in a position that people get into. You're up a piece, you got a totally winning position, and you just let your guard down, right? So I did that. Queen takes d7. Total blunder. And we'll see why in a second, if you don't see already. So a4, a better continuation would have been something like getting my outside pass pawn going. a4, rook fe8, queen a3, rook ec8, rook fc1, queen c5, trading queens a5, king f7. So now I've got this outside pass pawn. I've got an extra bishop, and this is just totally winning for whites had I not let my guard down. But let my guard down, and of course, if you haven't seen, the solution for black here is to play rook fd8, skewering my bishop, and I can't go queen b5 to defend it because the b rook is defending that square. Okay, sorry about that. Just had to take a pause there. Okay, so so yeah, the solution, rook f d8, skewering the bishop, and decision time now. So sort of how do I pull myself out of this? Not the end of the world. I'm going to give back a piece, it looks like, but I'm still up a pawn, right? So queen e7 is what I went for. Turns out there was a better option, queen a7. And so the idea of queen a7 in this position is to protect the a2 pawn, put pressure on black's b8 rook, forcing black's queen to stay in touch with it in the variations that are to come, and allowing my a rook to move about freely. So we'll sort of see some of those ideas play out in this variation. So queen a7, capturing the bishop, rook a to e1, hitting black's queen, queen to b5, resigning to the fact that they're going to lose their e pawn, but defending their b rook. Rook takes e6, rook b7, counterattacking my queen, queen a check, king g7, a4, hitting black's queen, queen d7. And here, white can actually go ahead and make luft with g3. Of course, important in this kind of situation, you don't want to get back rank mated. And the idea, if you haven't noticed it, is that white's rook on e6 is protected tactically. If black plays queen takes e6, white has queen takes b7. So rook takes c3, getting a pawn, rook f e1. And in this position, white has a clear advantage with the outside pass pawn. There's definitely still work to do, but this kind of position would have been more ideal than what I played in the game, which was, again, queen e7, with the idea of keeping in touch with the e6 pawn. After something like rook a to e1 or rook f to e1, the queen has to move. I'm going to win the e6 pawn. I think something like that was my thinking, but instead defending the a2 pawn and hitting the b8 rook would have been more ideal. So black takes the bishop, rook f e1, hitting the queen. Good move here by black, forcing some kind of queen trade and not just letting me win the pawn with nothing to say about it out at all. So I thought here a bit about queen takes e6, rook takes e6, but then black gets, so if I just sort of put that on the board, queen takes e6, rook takes e6. Now black has this, and it's not as active as I would have liked, as you'll see with the game. Queen takes d6, just taking black's queen. Black recaptures a4. So now I've got two pawns that black has to deal with in this variation, and I think I'm putting black more on their heels in this sort of variation, as opposed to this variation, which is what we would have got had, again, I played queen takes e6, rook takes e6, rook takes c3. So just trying to create a little bit more pressure on black's position. So rook takes d6, a4. Back to the game here. Rook c8, attacking the weak pawn. Rook e to c1. This shows, my move choice here shows the beginning of a recurrent theme in this endgame that we're going to see. And I think this is really instructive as far as there were like 2 or 3 elements of this endgame that I think were really instructive, and this is the first. So rook e to c1 is what I played, just getting behind the pawn, a very natural move. As it turns out, rook a3, defending the pawn laterally and allowing the e rook to come over to a1, or in some cases to add a second defender to the c3 pawn via going to c1 would have been more ideal. And we'll see why here in a second. So little nuances here in the endgame. I think a lot of us could get a lot of benefit from sort of getting a feel for these nuances more and more. So let's check them out. So rook e to c1, again, is what I played rather than the better move rook a3. Black brings their king up, a5, rook a6, stopping the advance of the pawn. Rook c2 is what I played, and again, rook a3, doing the lateral defense and allowing the c rook to slide over to a1, if needed, would have been more ideal. So again, didn't play that, just thought I was going to bring this rook up and over to a2, expecting black to put the second rook on the a file, but black doesn't need to do that. And credit to them, they played rook c to c6, and here I had my last chance to try to save one of my outside pawns here that are really putting pressure on black's position, and I missed the opportunity. And again, what should I have played? I should have played rook to a3. I didn't do that, didn't appreciate sort of the danger that I had here. Didn't appreciate the danger that I had here, and just thought, okay, I'm going to push a pawn, advance it, because I need to get my pawns closer to queenie, and black played the excellent move, rook to c5. This essentially wins a pawn, and from here the game should be drawn with best play. White plays f3, making a path for their king, and sort of going from there. So now we have a part of this endgame. I'm not going to really say a whole lot about it. Like I said, it should have been drawn from this point. I'm going to go through the moves and not really give a lot of commentary until we get to where black slips up and I get another chance at it. So rook a takes a5, as they should, trading rooks, and now I'm thinking, okay, I can at least put pressure by pushing the c pawn, and as it turns out, even though this position right here is completely drawn, this pressure was a little bit too much for black to handle. So rook to a7, king to f2, bringing the king up, king to f6, king to f1. This was kind of a weird mouse slip. I don't really know what happened here. I was trying to play king to e3, and yeah, just some weird glitch in the matrix happened. As it turns out, engine says doesn't matter, doesn't affect the position at all. It's still totally drawn. So rook to c7, getting in front of the pawn. King to e2, king to e5, king to e3, king to d5. Looks like black's going to win the pawn, and black will actually be up a pawn in such a situation, so I have to be careful. King to f4. I think this move is really instructive for people just trying to tweak their endgame play a little bit. So yeah, it definitely looks like black is winning the c pawn, but how can I get counterplay, right? So king to f4, trying to get into black's king side. And trying to get into black's king side, black does what looks to be the obvious move, right? h6, just stopping me from coming in. But as it turns out, this more or less gave me an option or an ability to win the game. It gave me winning chances, simply put, once again, because I had the resource rook d2 check. And this forces the king, black's king and not their rook, to capture the c5 pawn, which is really important because after king takes c5, I can enter with my king. I've brought black's king away. Black plays king to b6. Not really sure. I guess they want to not block their rook in. And then I go ahead with rook to d6 check. Just trying to line my rook up on all of black's pawns. As it turns out, the simple king takes e6 was maybe the best move, but I think there was a really instructive move which was also better, slightly better than the moves I played here, which is worth sort of looking at in terms of illustrative endgame technique type issues. So white had rook b2. In this position, black does not want to go back to the C file. If they do, rook c2 is played, and on the next move I take the rook, trading the rooks off, take all black's pawns. That's totally winning. So black has to go to the A file, let's say king a5. In such a situation, we have something like the following continuation. King takes e6, rook c6 check, rook c5, king f6, rook c6 check, king g7, putting pressure on the h-pawn, g5, defending the h-pawn, f4, g takes, rook f2, putting frontal pressure on black's isolated pawns, king to b6, h4, not being in a hurry. Again, computers are deadly in terms of their analysis, things we humans don't see or think of. Like most people just immediately capture the f4 pawn here, but just improving your position, the computer says, is the way to go. h5, now taking rook c2, g3, rook c3, now taking a pawn, taking on g3 with check. And although there's still work to be done in this position, with black's king cut off from the action on the other side of the board, white should be able to win this. And this is why, in this resulting position, you get black's king way out of play. And the instructive point is that it all started with this move, rook b2 check, forcing black's king to get farther away from the action. So rook d6 check, king b5 takes e6, king c4 takes g5, and now I just start mopping up the pawns. Rook c5 check, king f4, h5, rook g5. I could have played rook f6, not a whole lot of difference there. h4 takes f5, black tries to hang on, rook c8, king g4, king to d3, black tries to get into my position and get some counterattacking play. Makes sense. Taking the pawn, king e2. Now black's into my position and I've got to be careful. g4, so trying to advance my pawns and not have as many things for black's king to attack. King to f2. Now, importantly, black has taken away the g3 square, and I've got to be careful not to get my king in trouble in this sort of position. So king g5 getting out of the way, rook g8 check, king f4, rook h8. Now it looks like black has won a pawn, but there's actually a neat, nifty little trick here that I was able to find, which essentially should force resignation, and that's the move h4. So I still give up the pawn. I'm resigned to giving up this pawn, but how can I give it up in the way that's most advantageous to me, right? So if black takes this pawn, and I don't really know what else they're going to do in such a situation, the point is I have this trick, rook h5, trapping the rook, forcing a rook trade, and essentially forcing the end of the game. Instead, black goes for this rook takes g4, but f takes g4, and the game's over. So I think it was a really instructive game in terms of issues that I think a lot of people at my rating range and lower run into. You get a winning position, which is what I had after winning the knight earlier on in the middle game. So this move, queen a3, forking the rook and the knight, and black misses the opportunity to counterattack with rook d8. I win a knight, and smooth sailing. I think the engine says this is like +6 or something at this point. Really instructive to not let your guard down, right? I go in for this pawn capture, which is just a massive blunder, and we got to be on the lookout for things like this. And then later on, a couple of interesting elements to look at in the end game. I thought it was a really interesting game. Not so much of a thing that I wanted. That's not terribly interesting. I would lose my fair share of games, as we all do. But the elements of the game, I think, were really instructive. So I hope you got something out of that game. If you did, Let me know. Let me know if you got any questions, any comments in terms of your analysis, suggestions, anything like that. And yeah, just looking forward to making some new content soon. Thanks for watching.